very difficult times. The global financial crisis had a devastating impact on the European Union. The financial problems of the Eurozone were so serious that many external observers ventured to predict an imminent collapse of the European single currency. The peoples of Europe have had to learn how to live under austerity programs that imperil their living standards. Emigration problems have been exacerbated by the Syrian refugee crisis and Islamic terrorism. While the first signs of recovery finally appeared in the EU, the next major challenge came: Brexit. The decision of the British people to leave the European Union not only implied that the European project would lose one of its four major economies, but something that was potentially more dangerous. That if people were given the opportunity to vote on membership of the European Union in a referendum, they would reject it. European unification could be defeated by its worst enemy, which mainly inspired its birth: nationalism. The last 10 years have been a golden era for doomsayers and specialists in Western decline, and there have been many of these since the beginning of the 20th century. Before every single problem that EU governments and institutions have faced, they have enjoyed warnings that the EU is doomed to disappear and that Europe on the whole is increasingly irrelevant in a new bipolar world mainly led by the United States and China, in which the latter is destined to gain the upper hand. Yet the most recent crisis has not been exclusively European but a global crisis, and it does not seem so serious if we look at it from an historical perspective. For a continent that has survived 2 world wars, the problems faced by the Europeans over the last years seem quite manageable. Europe has assets that no other power or civilization possesses. Its most important legacy is the world in which we live, and this in itself is enough to guarantee a very relevant role in the 21st century. For Europeans shaped the modern world, as this book will explain. This book is written for readers from all walks of life and from any part of the world, all of you who have a passion for history, an infinite curiosity, and an eagerness to acquire knowledge, not to be confused with information, which is easily accessible in the internet era. It will be particularly relevant to those who have asked questions like, what has Europe done for us? What historical trends explain the present? Who provided the essential elements of our contemporary society? The aim of this book is to explain why Europe dominated the world from the 16th century to the 20th century, in what way did it influence other continents and peoples, and finally, what were the consequences of this era of hegemony exerted by the Europeans. The curiosity of the Europeans for other worlds, their wish for expansion and conquest, as well as their economic needs took them much further than they could ever imagine. On reaching the zenith of power, the Spanish Empire not only stretched across a great part of the American continent, but it was also a global empire over which the sun never set. Portugal also consolidated an empire that included territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The British Empire at its height in the early 20th century covered a fourth part of the globe and held sway over a fifth of the world population at that time. In that same era, the territories under French dominion were also formidable, as they included almost half of the African continent. And of course, a very notable example of terrestrial expansion was Russia, which managed to include a sixth of the earth in its frontiers. Holland in the 17th century created an empire of much more modest dimensions, but that was enough for this small nation to reach economic hegemony. The world. Political influence was a very important dimension due to the fact that many nations were created based on the model of the European nation-state. There was also an ideological influence as the ideas of the old continent propagated across the world. Economic power had paramount importance, for access to so many natural resources at global level was going to be essential to explain Europe's economic growth. Furthermore, European powers managed to create a global market. Last but not least, Europe was going to exert its hegemony from the cultural point of view, for thanks to the expansion of its powers, Western culture prevailed in a great part of the world. There was even a spiritual aspect of European dominance as a result of the extraordinary propagation of Christian religion. Several governments considered that propagating Christianity was one of the main justifications for imperial expansion, and missionaries were going to play an essential role in this task. A very important factor that contributed to European dominance of the world in all mentioned aspects was demography. Emigration of the European population and its permanent settlement in other continents accompanied the great powers in their expansion, especially in the Americas. One of the reasons why the empires reached so far was due to the migratory zeal experienced by Europeans and the networks of emigrants created by them, particularly between the 19th and 20th century when the mass migratory waves took place. Imperialism and European colonial expansion have not only been criticized by the people who considered themselves their victims but also by the Europeans, including the inhabitants of the old colonial powers, who were mostly to benefit from them. This is mainly due to the fact that these phenomena are identified with nations and cultures oppressed by the great powers, indiscriminate slaughters, and worst of all, genocide. Racism is also very much associated with European expansion of the world, and finally, slavery. None of these evils is exclusively European, for unfortunately the history of infamy is universal. It took place before the era of European hegemony and it has continued after. But undoubtedly European imperial history is full of blood, submission, exploitation, humiliation, suffering, and injustice. This book will pay the attention that they deserve, and the names of those who were primarily responsible for these evils will appear on these pages. On the other hand, we will also examine the contribution made by Europe to the creation of the modern world by means of imperial expansion and European experiences that have usually been considered beneficial for the whole of humanity. This list would be led by the propagation of the system of government that is generally considered as the best, or at least the one that confers more powers upon the citizens, democracy. Also the ideas that enable its proper functioning, like the rule of law, the separation of powers, parliamentarianism and the principle of equality of all citizens, individual liberty, and finally, human rights. A very important European political contribution for all the peoples on earth was the nation-state. Another obvious contribution is that of the market economy that was inexorably implemented by people throughout the world as the best way of exchanging products between human beings and generating wealth. There is also a long list of benefits that many citizens in the world enjoy as a consequence of the propagation of European scientific and technological advances. These include more efficient agricultural methods that provided food for a rapidly expanding population and prevented famines, transport and communication technology that allowed a more rapid exchange of peoples, products, and capital, and finally, modern medicine that allowed many illnesses to be cured and has contributed to a general increase in life expectancy. To summarize, we shall examine an epic history, as the expansion of Europe is, with its lights and shadows, its main representatives so much those who inspired admiration as those who were despised in the ideas that were propagated. With this aim in mind, we shall examine the expansion of several European countries by means of their military settlements, colonial empires, entrepreneurial projects, and migration of citizens. We will analyze one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of humanity, the arrival of Europeans in other continents. We will review the lives and works of sailors like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, great figures of British expansion like Captain James Cook, Robert Clive, and Cecil Rhodes, and other extraordinary figures from France, Holland, Russia, and other countries. On the other hand, this book will also pay attention to the experience of anonymous Europeans who arrived in other continents for very diverse reasons, from soldiers and civil servants, emigrants and fortune seekers, to prisoners and exiles. It will also deal with the confrontation with other peoples in conquered lands, how some of them were exterminated, and the clash of cultures. Finally, it will also examine some of the literature that the European expansion bequeathed. Europe not only shaped the world in the process of the rise of its great powers but also that of decline and dismemberment of its empires, as we shall see in the last chapters of this book. We will see how the crisis of imperialism and 2 world wars precipitated the end of the era of European hegemony. We will examine the impact that imperialism, taken to its extreme levels, had on European powers, and the birth of the post-colonial world, in which the European legacy provoked much controversy but was ultimately to be so influential. Finally, we shall see how Europe reinvents itself in the post-war era, and how the process of European unification and the internal organization of its society allow Europeans to continue exerting a very influential role in setting the main trends of the contemporary world. A lot has been written about the era of European hegemony, about its empires and great powers. I would not have been able to write this book without benefiting from the contribution made by all authors that I mention in the bibliography. Nevertheless, explanations about Europe's leading role in making of the modern world are very rare. One explanation for such an important gap in literature is that historians, political scientists, economists, and authors in general who are interested in the topic of imperial expansion or global dominance have approached it from a national but not a European perspective. Until only a few decades ago, Europe was deeply divided into nations, and ancient rivalries were rife. This is one of the reasons why both authors and readers in general showed little interest in looking beyond their own national experiences. Fortunately, to compensate for this, there have been an increasing number of historians who have specialized in countries that were not theirs, and made magnificent contributions. Increasing mutual comprehension among nations, particularly in the academic sphere, may account for the fact that we now have very good books on the contemporary history of Europe, capable of looking beyond the psychological barriers of national frontiers. On the other hand, very few historians have been tempted by the challenge of comparing the experience of all the European nations that expanded throughout the world. Undoubtedly, the bitter legacy of old rivalries and war have been very influential, contributing to make all factors that separated them be considered more important than what brought them together. There were empires like the Spanish, the French, or the British that were considered by themselves civilizations in their own right, especially in the case of France. All of them were aware of being part of a great Western civilization, but not so much part of a European civilization, for Europe was a geographic term and a vain cultural reference but nothing more. Nevertheless, in contemporary Europe, and particularly in the European Union, the meaning of the term European has changed radically as a result of an ever-increasing union between states and peoples. Not only do we need a narrative that explains to Europeans the history and the culture that they share, as it has been done over the last decades, but also one that may contribute with an explanation about the role that they have played in the world and what their legacy is. This is particularly relevant at a time like the present, when the members of the European Union have been building a common foreign policy and discussing global strategies to defend and promote EU interests in the world. And it becomes urgent with the global crisis that we have suffered over the last years, when the whole process of political and economic union has fallen into disarray. Nationalist, xenophobic, and populist parties throughout Europe defy the existence of the European Union, reverting to ideas that actually led to the destruction of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Islamic terrorist groups break peace and security in several European capitals with increasing frequency, and mass migration that fails to assimilate undermines the values on which European society was built. Perhaps more than ever, Europeans need to come to terms with their history, and the rest of the world needs to understand the nature of its relationship with Europe. Ever since wars and barbed wire frontiers in Europe were replaced by the free movement of peoples, services, and capital through Europe, there has been an increasing number of Europeans who are aware that their identity spans a space that is much wider than the nation to which they officially belong. This has specially been my case. As a result of my family background, I was brought up between 2 countries that have been historically confrontational, Spain and Britain. From grade school to college, I have always been surrounded by classmates from diverse European backgrounds. My wife is French and Spanish, at home we speak in English, French, and Spanish, and my children have the blood of 3 great powers, Spain, France, and Great Britain, and they are being brought up under the influence of these 3 cultures. It will therefore be understood why for me, and even more for my children as soon as they are old enough to be aware of it, to be European means something more than a geographic term, as it clearly defines what our identity is. This European identity, as well as my affinity towards several European nations, have deeply marked my academic trajectory. I have always been very interested in comparative history, not only of Britain and Spain, the countries that I know best, but also of other great European nations. In my travels through all these countries, I have always asked myself about their similarities and their differences, and the extent to which the history that they have shared or that has confronted them marks their present. As it generally happens with Europeans, I have become particularly aware of my European identity during my stays away from the old continent. The origins of this book can be traced back to the journeys I have made through the world over the last decade. On the beaches of St. Lucia, the cafés of Old Havana, strolling along the elegant avenues of Boston or Buenos Aires, or on the train from Delhi to Jaipur, the European legacy in all these places led me to ask many of the questions that I have attempted to answer. In this book, I have followed a chronological and thematic approach. Chapter 1 starts by answering a question of crucial importance: why did Europe, rather than any other civilization, manage to reach global hegemony and shape the rest of the world? The Renaissance mainly provides the answer. A remarkable era that allowed the early development of the knowledge-based society, science, empiricism, and the market economy, all of which were going to give Europeans a crucial advantage over the rest of the world. The curiosity about the limits of the earth and the desire to discover trade routes that would generate wealth, together with an adventurous spirit developed by navigators and explorers in that era, explains why some European powers acquired such an advantageous position from the 16th century. Chapter 2 will examine how European navigators laid the foundations of an era of European expansion, and how the most important explorer of all, Christopher Columbus, radically altered the fate of Spain and the rest of Europe with the discovery of America. The Iberian pioneers in the European expansion divided the New World among themselves and consolidated huge empires there. They were soon followed by England, France, and Holland in the process of building overseas empires. Apart from the Atlantic powers, other European kingdoms were soon to follow suit in imperial expansion, like Denmark and Sweden. Russia, on the other hand, played a very important role expanding toward the east and consolidating an immense land empire. Chapter 3 will examine this process and answer the following crucial questions: what kind of empires did all these nations create? To what extent was their expansion motivated by the same needs? How did they manage to control and administer such vast territories? Finally, what were the economic benefits of imperial expansion and how did they affect international relations? The era of revolutions had enormous repercussions both in Europe and the imperial world. For this reason, Chapter 4 is devoted to this topic. The French Revolution shook the European world. Nevertheless, a few years before the old regime started to crumble on the other side of the Atlantic with the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1776. This chapter analyzes the impact that the creation of the United States of America had, and the ways in which the principles of the Enlightenment influenced the founding fathers of this great nation. It will then explain how the revolutionary wave spread across the American continent, dismantling the Spanish and Portuguese empires. In this chapter, we will also analyze the great changes brought by this era, like the abolition of slavery and the creation of a new Atlantic world. The expansion of European powers in Asia was crucial to reach global hegemony. Chapter 5 focuses on this topic. It will examine the colonization of India by several powers until Britain gained the upper hand, and the impact that the Indian subcontinent had on the British Empire. The European incursion into China will be treated in detail, and finally, an event of great repercussion on the Asian world, the rise of Japan as a westernized power. European emigration is essential to understand the impact of imperial expansion. For this reason, Chapter 6 is devoted to the great European migratory waves through the world. As we shall see, the development of American nations from the United States to Argentina cannot be understood without the contribution of European migration and the networks they created. Europe experiences a golden age in the 19th century, as Chapter 7 explains. Imperial expansion and the Industrial Revolution are the main explanations for the phenomenal wealth that European powers acquired at that time. This is also an age of improvement in all spheres and great intellectual creativity that led to the emergence of a new European way of life that was internationally admired. All major political ideas of our present-day world emerged in Europe at this time. This chapter also examines the global impact of major European technological innovations of that era. For a long time, Africa was hardly affected by European expansion. Nevertheless, as Chapter 8 will show, in no more than 2 decades the European powers distributed among themselves this great continent toward the end of the 19th century. The so-called scramble for Africa considerably increased rivalries among great powers, with deep consequences in the era of imperialism, and it was also to determine the 2 world wars were the most devastating way in which Europe shaped the world. Chapter 9 examines how is it possible that Europeans fought these wars despite the fact that they were going to be so self-destructive, how so many nations were dragged into them, and finally, how they precipitated the end of the era of European supremacy. An unexpected way in which Europeans influenced other nations has been through exile. Chapter 10 focuses on this issue that has not received the attention it deserves. Citizens were forced to abandon several countries because of political, ethnic, or religious persecution. This was particularly the case among members of the Jewish community. For this reason, the development of the Zionist movement is examined here, culminating with the creation of the State of Israel. This chapter also dwells on the consequences of what I describe as intellectual migration and the exodus of many of the great European talents of that era. Were colonial empires doomed to disappear, or was this another consequence of the world wars? Chapter 11 deals with these questions. It also explains the rise of the Third World and the extent to which it lived under the influence of former colonial powers and European culture. This chapter also explains another factor that played a crucial role in the Third World, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and communism as one of the most influential ideologies of the 20th century. The final chapter of this book deals with the rebirth of Europe in the post-war era through the creation of the European Union and the emergence of what has been called the European Dream. It explains the factors that made possible the welfare state and its effect on European society. It analyzes how European integration managed to eradicate war between its nations and embark on a process of unification that has allowed Europe to continue playing a very influential role in global affairs. It will also explain why, in spite of all its shortcomings and internal crises, the European Union has set some of the global trends that determine the 21st century. What is the final outcome of more than 400 years of European hegemony in the world? What is the most important legacy in Europe? Can the present global world be understood without referring to Europe? Does Europe have a relevant mission in the world of the 21st century? The reader will find the answers to these great questions at the end of this book and after the journey that we shall make in these pages through 5 of the most fascinating centuries in universal history. Europa from myth to reality. How Renaissance Europe gave birth to an expanding civilization. It was not until the Renaissance that the peoples of Europe acquired the strength and capacity to expand their civilization. Europe is a small continent with a loosely defined eastern border. That little promontory of the Asian continent, as poet Paul Valery defined it. As so many aspects of its identity, Europe got its name from a Greek myth. Europa was the mother of King Minos of Crete, who was abducted by Zeus and named most of the land after her. The Greeks started to call their lands to the west of the Aegean Sea Europa, to differentiate them from those in Asia Minor. The earliest references that can be found to Europe as a geographical term is in the 8th century, in relation to Charlemagne's empire, which spanned across most of Central and Western Europe. It was not really until the 13th century that the continent of Europe began to be identified by such a term by its inhabitants. Until then, Europe was more commonly known as Christendom. Together with the legacy of the Greek civilization and the Roman Empire, it was Christianity that initially brought the inhabitants of this continent together. External threats and invasions have been an important contributing factor to make people become aware of their identity and strengthen their cohesion. For the peoples of Europe, it was the rise of Islam and the Islamic invasions that provided them with a sense of identity and an awareness of belonging to the Christian world. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II called upon the Christians to defend the Byzantine Empire from the Turkish threat. This campaign was followed by 3 other so-called Crusades, which allowed Christians to go as far as Jerusalem to defend this holy land where their origins were. Despite the mixed success of the Crusades, they did contribute to the rise of a sense of identity among the peoples of Europe. They also reinforced their determination to defend their faith and their territory from external invasions from Islam or any other civilization. But at that time, the Christians in Europe were a civilization fighting on the defensive and lacking capacity for expansion. The Arab civilization for a long time had proven to be stronger than the Christian European one, and it also showed much better prospects for expansion. The Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, had called upon the Arabs to spread this religion. Shortly after his death in the year 632 CE, Arabs embarked on an extraordinary process of conquest and expansion, with the ultimate aim of spreading Islam and converting as many infidels as possible, as the Prophet had ordered. From the Arabian Peninsula, they conquered Syria in 634, Persia in 664, and from there Muhammad bin Qasim led the first successful attack on India in 715. The eastern expansion of Islam continued across the Indian Ocean until it became firmly established in the Malay Peninsula by the 14th century. Islam even threatened the frontiers of the Chinese civilization in 678, when Arab pirates looted Canton in 678. After spreading across the whole of North Africa, Islam crossed into Europe and became the most imposing threat to the Christian world. By the 8th century, most of the Iberian Peninsula had been conquered by Islamic forces, and even then they threatened to continue moving toward northern Europe, through Gaul. In the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon reflects on the consequences that the Muslim invasions could have had on European civilization, arguing that once they reached the Pyrenees they could have easily continued expanding all the way north up to Scotland. In which case, perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would at present be taught in the classrooms of Oxford. The success of this Arab empire was mainly based on the reconstruction of economic life, which had been inherited from the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. This was particularly the case with Al-Andalus, in southern Spain, where Moorish invaders benefited from the remainders of Roman and Visigoth splendor and revived it. Córdoba became a great center of learning. Technology was another key answer. The astrolabe and the quadrant were invented by Arabs and used for celestial navigation. They also replaced the traditional square sail, which the Romans used, by a triangular one that could beat into an adverse wind. This explains the facility with which the Arabs traversed the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and reached the Far East. The other key element to explain Islamic expansion is, of course, religious faith. Muslims were as convinced as the Christians that theirs was the true religion and that it was their moral duty to spread their religion to as many infidels as possible. By the 13th century, the Christians had reconquered most of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. But 2 centuries later, Islam began penetrating into Europe from the east. In 1453, the Ottomans invaded Constantinople, and from there they continued a westward advance until in 1529 Suleiman the Magnificent attempted in vain to capture Vienna. While Islam was stopped in Europe, it succeeded in its advance toward Asia. Turkish Muslim mercenaries led by Zihir Eddin and Muhammad Babur, a distant descendant of the great Turco-Mongol leader, Tamerlane seized Delhi in 1526. There they founded the empire of which Babur was the first great Mughal, and laid the foundations of an Islamic empire that was soon to dominate most of India. Through its golden age, from the 8th to the 12th century, Islam managed to dominate the Old World, and until 1492, when Columbus reached America, it very much shaped this world according to its interests and values. Islam had brought together important parts of Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Maghreb, and the Far East. Apart from religion, trade networks developed by the Islamic conquerors contributed to bring peoples from such diverse places together. Spices, silk, pepper, and pearls were brought from Arab merchants from the Far East into Europe. The first African slaves to reach Europe were brought by the Arabs. The Arabs also contributed to the spread of knowledge acquired by the ancient Greeks. Aristotelian philosophy was revived in Córdoba by the Andalusian polymath Averroes. Arabic numbers were one of the most enduring legacies bequeathed by the Arabs. The system of Arabic numbering reached Europe through Spain. Leonardo of Pisa, in his Liber Abaci, asserted in 1202 that the Arabic numbering system was better than the Roman one and contributed to a clearer thought. Once this numbering system was adopted by Europeans, it gradually expanded through the rest of the world. The other civilization in the world that was much stronger than the European in medieval times was the Chinese. Europeans were introduced to the Chinese civilization through the writings of Marco Polo in the early 14th century. According to one of its fantasizing descriptions, both the Chinese and Indian civilizations had so much wealth that they had palaces made out of gold. From then it spread through Europe that this faraway civilization was not only richer than Europe, but also more advanced in all aspects. While Europe was deeply divided into kingdoms, China had consolidated a strong state, ruled by an emperor who could trace his lineage back over 1,000 years. It was administered by a genuinely meritocratic administrative corps, the Mandarins, who gained access to the Chinese administration through a selective examination system. By the 13th century, around 10,000 families belonged to the Mandarin elite. Not only were they a pillar of the state, but their values of hierarchy, public order, and Confucian ethics helped strengthen Chinese social cohesion in a. Scientifically and technologically, China was also much more advanced than Europe. The blast furnace and cast iron were known by the Chinese long before the Europeans. They also used paper and the first printing techniques, almost 1,000 years before Europeans. Gunpowder was also invented in China, and its first cannons gave it a military superiority that went unchallenged for centuries. From the establishment of the Ming dynasty in the 13th century, the Chinese consolidated a territory that was almost as big as continental Europe, and Chinese language speakers proliferated from the steppes of Siberia to the Himalayas and the tropical jungles in Southeast Asia. Last but not least, China was much more populated than any other region in the world. By the 16th century it had over 100 million inhabitants, 2 times as many as Europe. The sense that they were superior to any other civilization and that they were very much the heart of the world explains why the Chinese referred to themselves as the Middle Kingdom. The feeling of being at the center of the world to a certain extent explains the lack of interest felt by the Chinese in exploring other regions. Nevertheless, a remarkable naval enterprise was launched in the early 15th century. The Chinese Navy had 1,350 ships in the year 1420, and in the first decades of the 15th century Chinese sailors had discovered a good part of the southern Pacific and had even reached the town of Malindi on the eastern coast of Africa in 1414. The theory that the Chinese discovered America several decades before the Europeans has even been defended by some researchers over the last years and received considerable attention, although convincing evidence has not been provided. China had all the necessary conditions for exploring and discovering new worlds and benefiting from them long before the Europeans could reach them, but it was not going to be the case. In 1436 an imperial edict forbade the construction of ships and a substantial part of the Chinese navy was dismantled. The reason for such drastic measure is the fact that the Mongols were threatening to invade the interior frontier. The emperor decided that in order to maintain the frontiers of his dominions it was imperative to focus on its defense and abandon vague projects of expansion across the seas. This was a turning point in Chinese history. From then on, China turned its back to the world, and the most advanced civilization became stagnant. The nation that for so long had the potential to acquire world hegemony as an imperial power merely became passive object of the great European powers. For many centuries, Europe was more backward than the Chinese and lacked the expansive capacity of the Islamic civilization. The key to explain how this relatively small continent, mainly populated by backward peoples, was transformed into a civilization that was to shape the world is in the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the most extraordinary cultural movement in history. It led to the discovery of the human being in all its dimensions, and ultimately to the discovery of the world. It produced a new mode of thinking that was to distinguish European civilization and eventually give it a leading edge over all others. It allowed Europeans to use knowledge and culture as a means for self-improvement, growth, and expansion. The scientific inventions and technical innovations that it generated brought great improvements in people's lives and led to a more sophisticated level of civilization. The changes this movement generated in all spheres of knowledge have been influencing humanity until the present. The Renaissance began in Italy in the 13th century and it gradually spread through a great part of Europe until the 16th century. For this reason, Italy can claim to be the mother of modern Europe. It fulfilled all necessary conditions for inaugurating this new era. Its people lived on the ruins of the great Roman Empire. Their Latin language gave them access to the documents that held all the secrets of the Roman-Greek civilization. Italy also had the papacy in Rome, which was to act as bridge between this ancient civilization and the emerging one in Europe. Pope Julius II, who commissioned Michelangelo with the decoration of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the 16th century, was determined to recover the architectural and artistic splendor of ancient Rome. The cities where this movement mainly took place, such as Florence, Venice, or Genoa, were all prosperous trading cities with a financial elite that was willing to invest in the promotion of art projects. Finally, Italy was rich in natural talent, for it was in these cities where the most significant figures of the Renaissance lived. At this time, Italian cities became magnets, attracting ambitious and adventurous people from diverse parts of Europe. They were also responsible for spreading the news of the Italian peninsula's civilizing influence. Petrarch, a 14th-century poet and scholar, devoted much of his work to reviving the cultural splendor of the Romans that had been lost in the Dark Ages, a term which he himself first used. He is considered as the father of humanism, the philosophy that places human beings at the center of everything, not just as a passive element of God's will or natural forces, inspired by Protagoras' quote that man is the measure of all things. Humanism inspires Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man, published in 1493 as one of the most important texts of this era, which develops the concept of human personality and emphasizes the uniqueness and worth of individuals. The acquisition of knowledge is very much at the heart of the Renaissance, and as a result of it, Europe lays the foundations of a knowledge-based society. From the early years of the medieval era, the first universities were created in places like Bologna, Salamanca, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and Heidelberg. The first communities of teachers and scholars exclusively devoted to learning and independent thinking, to a certain extent free from religious or political pressures, had a substantial impact on European culture. As a result of this, it gradually became accepted among the elites that knowledge was the key to human progress and prosperity. The new man that this era aimed to produce had to be educated from childhood until youth, and the proper intellectual training ought to be acquired for society's most important professions. In this way, universities became one of the key factors that gave Europeans an advantage over the rest of the world. Scholasticism, the method of promoting critical thought, spread among the first universities in Europe, and its followers started traveling in order to meet each other and exchange ideas. In this way, the first universities and their most notable scholars contributed to the spread of ideas around Europe. The greatest of all was Erasmus of Rotterdam, who took humanist thinking further than anyone in his time. Born in Rotterdam in 1466, he mainly lived in Basel and traveled frequently to London and Cambridge, for which he described himself as a man of the world. As an ordained priest, he criticized the superstition and corrupt practices of the Catholic Church and advocated a new scientific study of divinity, in this way leading a new trend of Christian humanism. His Adagia, a compilation of Greek and Latin proverbs that was published in 1508, was the world's first bestseller. Such widely used proverbs like, "In the kingdom of the blind the one-eyed man is king," or "Where there is life there is hope," were passed from antiquity into our modern era mainly as a result of Erasmus. No wonder that Erasmus was the first humanist to earn a living from his writings. Humanism and all the notable personalities that it produced during the Renaissance were responsible for a new frame of mind, which was to shape European civilization and modernity. As a result, religious faith gradually moved away from superstition and became more influenced by reason. Tradition was revived, but it cohabitated with a great degree of innovation, and an inquisitive spirit led to extraordinary scientific breakthroughs. Above all, humanism generated the growing conviction that humanity was capable of mastering the world in which it lived and that all spheres of life could be both controlled and improved. Humanism explains the extraordinary works of art produced by the Renaissance that have been admired ever since, like the old sacristy in Florence, the Sistine Chapel in Rome, or the Mona Lisa. Their authors, Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci, acquired a reputation and celebrity that had been unprecedented in their professions. From then, artists began to be seen as special individuals that deserved a prominent role in society. This idea has played a very important role in Western civilization until the present. A proof of this is the fact that in 2017 Salvator Mundi, a long-lost Leonardo da Vinci painting of Jesus Christ, was sold at a Christie's auction for a record $450 million. Technological advancement played an essential role in this era. Around the year 1300, Venetians invented the convex glass mirror. A century later, mirrors were rapidly spreading through Europe. Those who could afford it, initially only monarchs and aristocrats, paid substantial amounts for acquiring this expensive metal device, which allowed them the privilege of looking at themselves. Until the invention of the mirror, people had been able to see their faces vaguely reflected in bronze or other metallic surfaces, or simply in water. But from the early 14th century, peoples of Europe began to see how they actually were. This had a great impact on individual identity. Until then, a person's identity was mainly acquired through interaction with other people. Mirrors, on the other hand, allowed people to see how they actually looked, and this played an important role in the rise of a new individualism. The fact that people became aware of their uniqueness as human beings contributed to their proper identification. In the Renaissance, every person, regardless of social strata, began to be known by a surname as well as a personal name. This had been the custom in ancient Rome, but only the royals and the nobility retained it until medieval times. From the 13th century, particularly in Italy and France, every person, regardless of social origin, began to use a second name, a nickname, or the place they came from as a surname, and this became hereditary. Individual and family identification was to have a substantial impact on every European society from then on. A name and a proper identity was no longer the privilege of kings, nobles, or popes. Another major European invention of the 14th century was the clock. Other civilizations had developed methods for measuring time, as the Chinese did with sundials, but they were not as precise and efficient as the counterpoise clock that emerged in Europe at that time. From then, any European city could not feel proud of itself unless it had one of these great clocks, usually in the facade of town hall or the church tower. Clocks reminded people of the importance of time in their daily lives, contributing to better organization and productivity. Measurement of time was improved by the Gregorian calendar, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. It was an improved version of the Julian calendar that had been used since the times of Julius Caesar, and it was eventually to become the standard international civil calendar. From then on, time could be measured efficiently, just as people's ages. The 15th century brought the most important agents of change. Printing, gunpowder, and the compass were described by philosopher Francis Bacon as the three inventions that changed the world. Around the year 1440, Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz in the Holy Roman Empire, invented a printing press with movable and replaceable metal letters. Until then, Europeans had been printing texts using a form of woodblock printing, similar to the Chinese method. But with Gutenberg's invention, the press could be used as many times as necessary in order to print many different books. Printing became the first means of mass communication, allowing the production of books, periodicals, and newspapers in great numbers. In this way, knowledge could be spread to the bulk of the population. With the exception of writing itself, no other invention has had such an impact on the history of culture as the printing press. In 1455, Gutenberg tested the efficiency of his invention with the publication of a book that every good Christian wanted to read, the Bible. But the major breakthrough in the publishing world came with the appearance of vernacular Bibles. Only the educated elite could read Gutenberg's Bible, which was in Latin, but people from all over Europe wished to read the Bible in their own language. The first Bible in German was published in 1466, and versions in major European languages were soon to be published. Vernacular Bibles had a snowball effect in the publishing world. As people bought vernacular Bibles, they also became interested in reading books on other subjects. The demand for books steadily increased from the end of the 15th century, giving birth to publishing as a major industry. Publishing had other important benefits in society. It acted as a catalyst to scientific advancement. Major scientific works like Nicolaus Copernicus's book on the revolution of celestial spheres, published in 1543, could be widely read by members of the scientific community. It also greatly limited the Church's censorship capacity, as books allowed scientific ideas to be rapidly spread. Printing also contributed to the spread of literacy. As so much knowledge was transmitted in book form, reading began to be seen as an essential skill that every person ought to have. As a result of the spread of literacy, people gave greater importance to the written word, a factor that very much changed the nature of the relationship between citizens and authorities. From the early 15th century, most European authorities began to keep records of people's births, marriages, and deaths. This also contributed to enhancing individual identities, among other advantages. Finally, a less obvious consequence was to strengthen the role of women in society and improve their relationship with men. Europeans had always given women a more important role than other civilizations. Such powerful positions as those of Queen Isabella of Castile, Elizabeth of England, or aristocrats like Katerina Sforza would have been inconceivable in China, India, or even less in the Islamic world. Even so, women were still generally considered inferior to men in medieval Europe, but this gradually began to change with the proliferation of books. This allowed women, the minority of them who could read, of course, the same access to knowledge as men. It also afforded the most talented ones the opportunity to write books, which explains why from the 16th century on women authors began to emerge in Europe. Gunpowder could not rank in importance with the printing press, but it did play an essential role in the emergence of Europe before other civilizations. In its basic form, it probably reached Eastern Europe from China through the Silk Road. From the 15th century, Europeans transformed it into an offensive and defensive weapon, and it was one of the factors that later made the military revolution possible, which played such an important role in Europe's expansion. By the end of that century, European troops were experimenting with mobile artillery, which allowed lighter and more efficient cannons to be transported. The full impact of European gunpowder was appreciated for the first time when King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, with what has been described as the first modern army. It included batteries of light mobile bronze field artillery, which fired iron cannonballs rather than stones. They destroyed every castle they aimed at. A new age of warfare had begun. From then on, cities were no longer invulnerable behind walls. The magnetic compass was the other great technological innovation of this time. Just like gunpowder, it seems likely that this was initially an importation from the East, as both the Chinese and the Arabs had used rudimentary compasses. An improved version, consisting of a needle suspended over a compass card, came into being in the 14th century and became widely used a century later. This magnetic compass allowed European sailors reach further than those of any other civilization from the late 15th century. But more than this tool, it was the proliferation of knowledge about the geography of the world that stimulated them to venture into the seas in search of unknown lands. Scholars and savants proliferating in the Renaissance provided diverse explanations about the shape and the size of the Earth, and the possible existence of other continents. From then on, Europe took the lead over other civilizations in the knowledge of geography and cartography. The Catalan Atlas, produced by a major chartmakers school in 1375, constituted a major improvement in cartography by giving India its proper shape. Europeans at that time gave names to the continents by which they were later universally known. Asia was named after the daughter of King Oceanus mentioned in a Greek myth, just as Europa was named after the daughter of King Agenor. Africa was the name by which the Romans referred to Tunisia, and from this time it began to be used to describe the whole continent. After Ptolemy's treatise Geographica was translated into Latin by Giacomo di Scarperia in 1406, the idea that the world was round was gradually to be accepted by the scientific community. Furthermore, it prompted a debate on what lay beyond the borders of the known world. Particularly influential in this sphere was the work Imago Mundi, written by the French cosmographer Pierre d'Ailly in 1410, which defended the theory that the world was asymmetric and that there were 4 continents in the world. This information began to be widely circulated when the first books on this subject were published toward the end of the 15th century. From then, many poor sailors began to think of the fortune-making opportunities that could be found by reaching unknown territories. This eventually led to the first voyages that were to change the fate of Europe in the world. The modern state began to be conceived during the 15th century. This was mainly thanks to Niccolò Machiavelli, another of the great minds of the Renaissance who has been considered the father of modern political science. Machiavelli worked as a senior official for the Florentine Republic and also served as a diplomat in Rome. His magnum opus, The Prince, published in 1513, was very much inspired by the brutal methods of Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare Borgia, which he witnessed when he was posted in Rome. The Prince is basically a guide on how to acquire and maintain political power. As the first political empiricist, Machiavelli based his recommendations on how people actually behaved in real life. It is much safer for the prince to be feared than loved, but he ought to avoid making himself hated. Quotations like this explain why this book has become one of the great classics of all time. From Henry VIII to Napoleon and Stalin, a wide range of statesmen from all over the world have not only read The Prince, but they have used it as a basic reference book to guide their careers. Machiavelli's Prince is one of the books that have been subject to most intense debate in history, as it is open to the widest interpretations. It is not clear whether it is a satire of the excesses of power or a compendium of good advice for potential governors on how to exert power. Although Machiavelli was criticized for justifying duplicity and immoral behavior in politics, philosophers from Francis Bacon to Jean-Jacques Rousseau admired this work for describing the realities of statecraft and also exposing the faults of one-man rule. Above all, Machiavelli made 2 essential contributions to modern politics. First, that politicians and their decisions have deep consequences on people's lives, and second, he defined the state as a territory in which an organized community exists under one government. Society was never the same from the moment people became aware that the way they lived was not a consequence of a divinely ordained plan, and that Their community needed to be ruled by laws and regulations that protected the general interest from personal ambitions and human whims. The economy had a leading role in the transformation of Europe during this era. The Renaissance could not have taken place without the contribution of bankers and wealthy philanthropists, opening up vast possibilities for the creation of beauty and the expansion of human knowledge. The financial world experienced a notable transformation from the 13th to the 15th century, laying the foundation of the market economy as we know it today. Some elements of the financial world that made this possible were imported from the East. Leonardo of Pisa studied Hindi-Arabic numerals and introduced it in the Book of Calculation, published in 1202. Fibonacci was not only responsible for giving Europe the decimal system, which makes calculation easier than Roman numerals, it also shows how it can be applied to commercial bookkeeping. Banking as we know it today emerged during the Renaissance. Venice, a great trading center open to Eastern influences, became the world's great lending laboratory. This explains why William Shakespeare was inspired by this city to create the most famous moneylender in Western literature, the Merchant of Venice. Here moneylenders made the transition to become bankers by developing the idea of credit and propagating wealth in society as a result of it. One of the major obstacles for the emergence of modern banking was the fact that Christianity, just like Islam, condemned as usury the charging of interest. But shrewd lenders found ways of benefiting from lending money in a more subtle way by calling the benefit obtained from lending money discretion, which was a compensation for the risk of lending money. It was in Venice where bankers began to be called by such a term, because they literally sat on a bench in front of a table, usually in marketplaces looking for customers. Bankers and merchants soon started using what became known in Genoa as the double-entry method, with credits and debits arranged in a way that greatly increased accounting efficiency and eventually became universal. A family that became particularly talented in all these skills associated with moneylending was the Medici, the first great banking family in history. The Medicis were originally foreign exchange dealers and moneylenders working in Florence. Among the customers of Giovanni de' Medici were several cardinals. He also bet on the return of the papacy to Rome at the time of the Great Western Schism. He was rewarded by Pope Martin V, who appointed him his banker in 1517. The papacy constantly needed more income throughout the 15th century in its determination to increase its power and influence. Financing the Pope's wishes and needs was an extremely profitable business that allowed the Medicis to become Italy's richest bankers. By the time Giovanni passed the business on to his eldest son Cosimo, he had established a branch in Venice and Rome and later added branches in Geneva, London, and Avignon. The Medicis were the first family to win princely status not by warfare, marriage, or inheritance but through commerce. They were also pioneers in philanthropy. Their patronage was responsible for some of the most extraordinary works of art during the Renaissance, and it very much helped to create an atmosphere where arts and humanism could flourish. The person who really showed the power of money in the modern era was Jacob Fugger, who has been described as the world's first modern capitalist. The Fuggers, a German merchant family that made a fortune in the textile industry, was a very good example of how rapidly money could change a family's status during the Renaissance. Jacob Fugger went even further than the Medicis, for he became the banker of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, who also inherited the Spanish crown and was therefore the most powerful man of his time. It is well known that without me your majesty might not have acquired the imperial crown, Fugger dared to write to the emperor. This was no exaggeration, for he had financed the Habsburg family in their rise to power, and he was to finance everything from wars to castle-building projects that consolidated the power of the Habsburgs. In this way Fugger was the creator of the sovereign debt, an essential instrument to finance the modern state, which was also to become a nightmare for future heads of government. Fugger can also be regarded as one of the first venture capitalists, giving money to those who came up with risky but potentially profitable ideas in return for a share of the business. Such was the case of Ferdinand Magellan's first circumnavigation of the globe. The relationship established between prominent businessmen like Fugger and navigators and explorers was to have a vital importance in Europe's ascendancy, for it made possible the discovery of the world. Families like the Medicis and the Fuggers were the most notable examples of social climbing and acquiring power by means of financial success. At a much modest level, peoples of Europe during the Renaissance learned how to earn a living in the trading or financial spheres, and used money for improving their position in society. Money was the great equalizer that allowed different social classes to establish a relationship in which there were simply buyers and sellers or lenders and borrowers. Feudalism, in which it was almost impossible for members of the lower strata to improve their station in life, gradually gave way to a new society in which the rules of the market economy prevailed. This contributed to the proliferation of fortune seekers who came up with money-making ideas in their own land, and were also particularly eager to travel the world in search of riches and open new markets. They were ultimately responsible for opening the trade routes that changed the fate of Europe. The culture of the Renaissance led to a major event that had deep consequences in the history of Europe, the Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther, a professor of theology and priest from Wittenberg, published the 95 Theses, denouncing the corruption of the Catholic Church. The 95 Theses is one of the most influential documents in the history of humanity. In particular, it criticized the Church's habit of selling indulgences, which according to Luther was nothing more than a ploy to make money. Luther went even further by asking uncomfortable questions like to what extent was the Pope an example of Christian virtue, and ultimately how could he forgive people for their sins when only God could do so. Luther was not only excommunicated by the Pope due to the 95 Theses, but his writings were banned. Nevertheless, he was not alone in voicing criticism of the Church. The Protestant revolt rapidly spread across Europe. Proliferation of vernacular Bibles and books that allowed people to acquire knowledge and think for themselves explains its popular appeal. The critical stage was reached when even monarchs supported Protestantism. In 1534, King Henry VIII declared himself head of the Church in England, refusing to obey the Catholic Church's authority. Shortly after, Denmark followed the same path. The schism in the Church provoked by the Reformation led to wars and persecution that lasted for over 100 years. Christendom, which had already been divided into two halves, the Catholics and the Orthodox, was then further split into three with the rise of Protestantism. Christendom ceased to be what unified Europeans, and as a result people no longer talked about Christendom in relation to the common territory where they lived, but about Europe. Catholicism, Protestantism, or one of the sects of Protestantism became one of the key factors defining kingdoms and nations emerging in Europe. The fact that as a result of the Reformation the Pope was no longer recognized as an authority in several kingdoms in Northern Europe had deep impact on the formation of the modern state. The Treaty of Augsburg in 1555 brought an end to hostilities between the Lutheran states in Germany and Charles V of Spain, who was head of the Holy Roman Empire. Peace was made under the maxim of cuius regio, ius religio, a recognition of the right of the sovereign of each country to choose the religion of his people. The power and independence acquired by rulers of Protestant territories because of this treaty had deep consequences in modern European history. Deep rivalry among them played a very important role in the modern world. While the Protestant North struggled for independence from Catholicism, its peoples also showed increasing eagerness to create wealth, which explains the rise of the ethic of thrift and hard work with which the great sociologist Max Weber identified. Protestants. Catholics reacted with the Counter-Reformation, which was an attempt to reform and reinvigorate itself. The Jesuits played a leading role in this process. This new religious order was founded by the Basque priest Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, an elite corps within Catholicism, focusing on education and missionary activity. Within a few decades after their founding, Jesuits were all over the world, propagating Christianity and educating the young. In parallel, Protestant missions were also to proliferate through the world from then on. The European continent was deeply divided between nations competing against each other for power and influence. Not only did they struggle for supremacy in Europe but also in the rest of the world, as we shall later see. This was one of the major reasons why Europe was to shape the world over the following centuries. The scientific revolution constitutes the definitive contribution to the modern worldview. Nicolaus Copernicus initiated this drastic break with the ancient and medieval frame of mind and the entrance into modernity. The great Polish astronomer and mathematician, born in Prussia in 1493, focused his career on proving that the sun was at the center of the universe rather than the earth, as it had been widely believed until then. The publication of Copernicus's book on the revolution of celestial spheres in 1543 marks the beginning of a long struggle between science and religious bigotry. Some decades later, the Italian polymath Galileo Galilei took the Copernican model and scientific mind to new heights. Galileo was condemned to house arrest by the Inquisition for defending Copernicus's theories. But this constituted no impediment to his extraordinary career, for which he was to be known as the father of astronomy. He was one of the first scientists to use a reflecting telescope, made by him to observe the stars, and also made groundbreaking contributions to physics. The revolution culminates with the English scientist Isaac Newton, who has been described as the greatest scientist of all time. His main work, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687, formulates the laws of motion and universal gravitation that were to dominate physics for over 3 centuries. Although Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton are the most conspicuous figures of this scientific revolution, several others made extraordinary breakthroughs in the spheres of medicine, biology, anatomy, chemistry, and geology throughout the 17th century. European scientists in this era also contributed to the establishment of a very important principle, that religion and science ought to be separated, as they could not be made compatible. This principle was also to be extended to the affairs of the state and the realm of politics. This separation eventually became a characteristic of the entire Western world. The rise of the first scientific academies in Europe also contributed to free and independent thinking. The first one was the Leopoldina Academia Naturae Curiosorum, founded in 1652 in Germany, the Royal Society, founded in London in 1660, and the French Académie des Sciences, founded in 1666. The scientific revolution would not have been possible without a new scientific method that emerged from the trends in philosophical thought in the 17th century. One of the main proponents of this method was the English philosopher Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism, who argued that science must be based on observation of facts, from which theory can be adduced. These ideas, which are commonplace now, were groundbreaking at that time. French philosopher René Descartes laid the foundations of rationalism, which regards reason as the chief test of knowledge. One of his most influential works, Discourse on the Method, opened new paths in the search of truth. His famous proposition, cogito ergo sum, has been learned by every student of philosophy in the Western world as an example of a truth that is incontrovertible. For all these reasons, Descartes is considered as the father of modern Western philosophy. While these philosophers laid the foundations of the modern scientific method and philosophical thought, others began to conceive new forms of government that were to influence theorists and government practitioners until our day. In 1516, the English statesman Thomas More published a book describing Utopia, an imaginary land with the ideal form of government, in which property is held in common, both men and women benefited from universal education, and all religions are tolerated. Utopia, which became a European bestseller in the mid-16th century, marks the beginning of a search for an ideal government that has existed in the public sphere in the Western world until today. More was also the first to describe a model of society in which there was no private property. Over a century later, another Englishman, philosopher Thomas Hobbes, published Leviathan in 1651, in which he justifies a very different form of government, absolutism. His work was inspired by the chaos and the horrors that he witnessed during the English Civil War. In his view, war where every man is enemy to every man is caused by the absence of a strong authority. He therefore justified the need for a king to exert his rights, which ought to be unlimited, to rule over the people. A leviathan, a monster composed of men, is his metaphor for the absolutist state, the only solution to prevent war and guarantee stability in society. With this book, however abhorrent to those who believed in individual liberties, Hobbes gave birth to the social contract theory and is also considered one of the founders of political philosophy. While philosophers speculated on the ideal society and the role of the state, other authors gave free rein to their imagination, giving birth to national literatures of Europe. Italian literature, another great product of the Renaissance, begins with Dante Alighieri, who published his famous Divine Comedy in vernacular language. From then on, authors began to express themselves in their own languages rather than in Latin. The printing press constituted a great encouragement for authors, and as a result of this, the 16th century saw the launch of full-blown national literatures in Europe. Consequently, popular literature became one of the essential attributes of any nation. Poetry and drama were the most popular literary genres. This explains the success of Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare in England, or later Molière and Jean Racine in France. But memoirs and biographies also become fashionable very much as a result of the characteristic individualism created by the Renaissance. The autobiography of the Florentine artist Benvenuto Cellini, published in 1566, constituted a new way of expression and influencing people, simply telling about one's life and explaining why it was important. From then on, in the same way that notable personages commissioned a portrait of themselves to be remembered in posterity, those who were more intellectually gifted would write their memoirs. A few decades later, a Spanish author, Miguel de Cervantes, published Don Quixote in 1604, which was an immediate success and was later translated into all major languages of the world. This book inaugurated a new genre, the novel, which eventually became the most popular literary genre in modern history. Fiction, expressed in literary masterpieces, became a very important channel by which Europeans were to influence modern minds throughout the world. It is against the backdrop of the scientific revolution that Europe's military revolution took place. As a result, European powers acquired military potential and expertise that allowed them to dominate the world until the 20th century. Technological advances gave way to remarkable improvements in gunpowder weapons and other military tools. The Swedes gained ascendancy in artillery techniques. During the reign of Louis XIV, the French adopted the bayonet, and their infantry acquired an edge over the rest. England focused on navy improvements, which eventually allowed it to rule the waves. Innovations in galleon design allowed English ships to become faster and lighter, and at the same time have sufficient capacity to carry heavier guns. The first big battleships were made by the English and then imitated by rival European powers. Military techniques radically changed due to technological innovations. The lance and pike were replaced by the arrow and musket, and gunpowder became the essential tool that determined military power. Armies increased in size by an extraordinary degree throughout Europe. Between 1600 and 1700, armies in most European countries increased over 5 times. The phenomenal growth of European armies would not have been possible without much greater wealth, as well as the increasing power and efficiency of state bureaucracies. In order to fund forces, taxes had to be collected on a much larger scale. The creation of a modern bureaucracy was fostered by the military exigencies of this era. Also, the first permanent parliaments were to be justified by the needs of the armies, as sovereigns needed to justify both taxation and war before the nobles and the church. In this way, the military revolution played a very important role in the emergence of the modern state. There is an obvious reason why Europeans on the whole acquired this extraordinary superiority of weapons in the 17th century, for there were only 3 years in which there was no fighting, from 1669 to 1671. The rest of the time most of the European peoples were at war with each other, and military innovations combined with the size of the armies determined who would emerge victorious. It is difficult to say which European country had the best army by the end of the century, but what is certain is that they were much stronger than those of other civilizations. This is proved by the last Turkish siege of Vienna in 1683. On that occasion a Polish-German force of 68,000 easily defeated the Ottoman troops of over 150,000. At the Battle of Zenta, on September 11, 1697, 20,000 Turks were killed, putting an end to the Turkish aspiration of expanding across Europe. It was no coincidence that 304 years later the notorious Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States took place on September 11. Islamic terrorists were hoping that this date would mark the return of Islam at the cost of Western supremacy. The Renaissance changed the fate of Europe from a relatively backward, inward-looking civilization, fighting on the defensive against incursions from south or east, to one that was secure of itself, proud of its achievements, and willing to expand all over the world. The cultural revolution that takes place in Europe from the 13th to the 17th century places the individual at the center of society, promotes a limitless curiosity, and develops a new method of thinking. As a result, the modern mind emerged. This led to an outpouring of intellectual innovation and creativity that has no precedent in history, allowing Europe to excel in all spheres of knowledge. The market economy, the state, and the knowledge-based society are three major products of the Renaissance that allowed Europeans to take the lead over all other civilizations. The new era of geographic exploration that begins in Europe in the mid-15th century is very much the consequence of all this. But it was an unexpected geographic discovery in 1492 that allowed Europeans to expand their power and influence beyond their wildest dreams. Norman Davies, Europe, A History. John Key, China, A History. Jacques Barzun, From Dawn to Decadence, 500 Years of Western Cultural Life, A Cultural History of Europe. Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince. Neil Ferguson, The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. Greg Steinmetz, The Richest Man Who Ever Lived, The Life and Times of Jacob Fugger. Jeffrey Parker, Military Revolution, Military Innovation and the Rise of the West, 1500–1800. As far as it is possible for a man to go. How geographic discoveries laid the foundations of European hegemony. On October 12, 1492, 3 caravels captained by Christopher Columbus reached an unknown island after sailing toward the west for 69 days. Columbus had very good reasons to be exultant when he set foot on that island, for he believed that he had found a new route to Asia that would earn him the fame and fortune that he had been craving all his life. But his discovery was more important than he could ever imagine, for it was not a new path to Asia that he had discovered but a new continent. Few dates have had deeper significance in the history of the world as the discovery of America. The discovery of this continent constituted the beginning of an era of expansion that would lead Europeans to enjoy world hegemony for several centuries. It was also a date that was going to mark the beginning of our modern era, an era in which Europe laid the foundations of our contemporary global civilization. Columbus mainly owed this extraordinary achievement to his intelligence, perseverance, and knowledge, but also to the Kingdom of Castile. Its sovereign aimed at expanding its frontiers and had the courage to endorse the very attractive but also extremely risky venture proposed by this Genoese sailor. It was the result of a combination of statecraft, patronage, technological innovation, and humanistic curiosity that the prodigious era of the Renaissance brought together. But why had Europe, and no other civilization before it, managed to reach and become aware of the existence of such a vast continent as America? Europe is not as richly endowed with territory, fauna, flora, and mineral resources as other continents. But to compensate for this apparent geographic disadvantage, Europeans had a very important asset in the race for world hegemony. They had more maritime communities than any other civilization. From the times of the ancient world, diverse European peoples had grown and thrived around strategic coastal areas. City-states like Venice or Genoa, or kingdoms like Aragon and Portugal, owed their prosperity to maritime trade networks. After centuries profiting from voyages around the Mediterranean and neighboring seas, by the 15th century many of these peoples were eager to venture into further overseas exploration. The era of great geographic discoveries was set to take place in Europe. The small kingdom of Portugal was going to be the pioneer in the movement of European expansion through the world. It was not as prosperous and powerful as France, England, or the rest of the kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, but it was more unified and cohesive. With an extensive Atlantic coast in the west and relative proximity to the African coast in the south, its geographic position gave Portugal a great advantage in order to lead what would later be known as the era of geographic discoveries. Their long maritime tradition contributed to their superiority in boat construction and sailing technology in the 15th century. The caravel was their invention, a lighter, highly maneuverable, and faster sailing ship that would allow them to reach further than any other nation. In 1415, under the kingdom of John I, Portugal made its first incursion into Africa with the seizure of Ceuta on the northern African coast, and the establishment of a settlement there. It was hoped that this strategic enclave near the Strait of Gibraltar would strengthen their position vis-a-vis other Mediterranean commercial powers like Genoa and Venice. Shortly thereafter, the Portuguese established agrarian colonies on islands like the Azores and Madeira. But this was only going to be the beginning of an extraordinary process of expansion that led Portugal to establish settlements in remote places and open horizons for the Europeans that would radically alter their destiny. The rise of Portugal in the world took place mainly as a result of the initiatives of King John's son, Prince Henry, better known as Henry the Navigator, despite the fact that he hardly ever left his country. Henry the Navigator was a typical representative of European royalty in the modern era. Portuguese, English, French, and Spanish blood ran through his veins. He was, as it could be expected from someone in his position, a good patriot and a devout Christian. But he was to stand out among the European royals due to his interest in the world of commerce, a topic that did not usually attract those who were born into ruling families. This made him support Portuguese expansion projects throughout the world with the eagerness of a present-day businessman. The reasons that led him to support expeditions to the south of the Azores were mainly commercial, obtain great benefits from the spice trade and discover new trade routes. But there were also religious and strategic reasons, for he wished to know how big the Muslim world was, and wanted to take Christendom to these lands, and at the same time find out if there were Christians with which he could make alliances. In 1434 the Portuguese managed to sail around Cape Bojador in western Africa. 1 decade later, in 1444, Nuno Tristão reached the Senegal River, and shortly after Dinis Dias took possession of Cape Verde, which would become a colony of great importance for Portugal. Shortly after, Henry the Navigator was granted by the Pope the right to exert sovereignty over all lands discovered by Portugal, from Africa to India. As a result of this extraordinary success in journeys of discovery and the papal blessings, it is not surprising that after Prince Henry's death in 1460 the Crown continued to support the exploration projects with great enthusiasm. In 1469 King Alfonso V, who would go down in history as the African, granted trading and exploitation rights to a merchant named Fernando Gomez on the condition that every year he would explore 100 leagues of territory. Gomez fulfilled his promise and reached the so-called Gold Coast in 1470. In 1481 Diego de Azambuja traveled with the aim of exploiting the west coast of Africa and founded San Jorge de la Mina, the first Portuguese settlement on the African continent. He was accompanied in this journey by 2 sailors that some years later would become much more famous than him, Bartolomeu Dias and Christopher Columbus. Particularly important were Diogo Chao's journeys through Africa. Chao delved into the heart of what was considered the Dark Continent, and reached the estuary of the Congo River, establishing the first contacts with the remote Congolese kingdom in present-day Angola. In this way the colonization of the most important Portuguese colony in the continent was going to start. In 1487, a Portuguese sailor marked another milestone in European exploration. Bartolomeu Dias managed to be the first European to sail across the southern border of the African continent through the Cape of Good Hope and reach the waters of the Indian Ocean. He failed in his aim of reaching India due to a water shortage, and many harrowing experiences suffered on this long journey. He was forced by circumstances to give up and sail back home, but made a triumphal entrance into Lisbon in 1488, giving the good news that he had opened up a new route toward India from the south of the African continent. While Portugal had consolidated a leading position in the era of discovery, due to the formidable achievements of its most talented navigators, the neighboring Kingdom of Castile experienced a meteoric rise in its status, mainly thanks to the contribution of Christopher Columbus. Who was Christopher Columbus? Columbus was not only one of the great personages of his time but also the one who has inspired most literature due to the deep consequences of his discovery. He himself left several written works about his voyages and achievements. However, several stages of his life have been subject to intense debate, among them his birth and origins. His son Ferdinand did not specify Columbus's place of birth in the biography that he dedicated to his father, which provoked all sorts of speculation about where the famous sailor was born. There are several peoples in Europe who have claimed to include Columbus among their prominent members. It has been said that Columbus was from Majorca, Catalonia, Greece, even France, Scotland, and Poland, while other sources claim that he was Jewish. But his most prestigious biographers seem to agree that he was born in Genoa in 1453, into a humble family. He was the son of a weaver, and did not receive any formal education, although he showed great eagerness to learn. He had delusions of grandeur from a very early age and always aimed to leave a deep mark in his time. This is why he decided to become a sailor, as it was one of the few professions that, in his circumstances, would allow him to climb the social ladder and make his dreams come true. Columbus started sailing from a very small age, according to his own account, and consequently by the time he was 30 he had acquired a broad experience as a sailor, having reached the coast of Guinea in the south and Iceland in the north. Just like many sailors of his time, he frequently asked himself about what there could be west of where his contemporaries usually sailed in the Atlantic. As he considered his profession a way of discovering the secrets of the world, he was particularly interested in the theories of the world's geography. Columbus was familiar with the scientific theories about the shape of the earth that became a common subject of discussion among sailors meeting in taverns around ports. Particularly influential for Columbus was Pierre d'Aily's work Imago Mundi, which defended the theory that the world was asymmetric and that there were 4 continents in the world. This knowledge, and above all his intuition as a sailor, would lead him to conclude that sailing toward the west it was possible to reach the Asian coast, and more precisely Zipangu, the land of God, the old name given Japan by the Europeans. After conceiving such a bold and adventurous plan, Columbus's next aim was to find a state willing to sponsor it, for sailors in those days, as well as artists, had no nationalist prejudices on looking for economic support that would make their projects possible. Any major European state could sponsor a journey of discovery, for all of them shared the same expansionist aims and also a very similar concept of civilization to promote in the rest of the world. The main candidates were Portugal, Castile, France, and England. Portugal, a pioneer in the era of discoveries and the first naval power, was the one that offered better prospects of success, so the Genoese sailor traveled to the court of John II in Lisbon, but he was turned down by the Portuguese king. For he was asking for too many rewards for such a risky venture. After failing with Portugal, Columbus contemplated the possibility of offering the project to other crowns, and even to his native Genoa, but he finally focused on the neighboring Iberian kingdom of Castile, and not only for reasons of proximity. The young and intelligent Queen Isabella of Castile, who was married to the ambitious King Ferdinand of Aragon, was eager to expand the power of her kingdom and was therefore likely to support Columbus's plans. The aspirations of this foreigner with visionary airs and an arrogant tone did not have a positive impact on the court of Castile, but he would eventually be compensated for his perseverance. In 1492, Castilian and Aragonese troops conquered the last Muslim territory of the Iberian Peninsula. Shortly thereafter, Columbus was summoned to Granada. In this city, Queen Isabella decided to accept the project of the Genoese sailor, despite the reticence of her advisors, and she gave him what he demanded in exchange: the title of Admiral and Viceroy of the conquered lands, and 10% of all benefits for him and his descendants. Initially, he had asked for 25%. This was all a very high price to pay, but it must be taken into account that he, like the majority of the conquistadors who succeeded him, risked not only all that they owned but their own lives in such adventures. Why did Queen Isabella decide to support Columbus? The euphoria of the Catholic kings after reconquering Granada must have influenced their decision, for after this success their dreams of conquering new lands on behalf of their kingdom and Christianity knew no limits. If Columbus's journey succeeded, Castile would obtain extraordinary benefits, and for this reason it was worth taking the risks despite the fact that their advisors disapproved of it. On the other hand, sponsoring Columbus's journey did not imply a heavy burden for the crown of Castile. Despite the legend that Queen Isabella had to pawn her jewels in order to pay for it, the truth is that money did not come from the royal coffers but from the shipowner Vicente Yanez Pinzon and his brothers. The Pinzon brothers not only provided the money for this great adventure but actually took part in it. Vicente Yanez Pinzon was the captain of one of the 3 caravels in which they sailed, the Pinta. As regards the crew, Christopher Columbus had considerable difficulty finding volunteers to embark on such a risky voyage. No soldiers or possible settlers were included, as this was a voyage of exploration, and a royal pardon to prisoners in jail who enrolled in this adventure allowed Columbus to recruit men from among the delinquent population. The 3 famous caravels set out from the Andalusian port of Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492. Thanks to Columbus's habit of leaving written records of all his maritime experiences, we know a lot about all that happened in this long voyage of discovery, including his thoughts and fears. After a few weeks in the Atlantic, a critical period was reached when some members of the crew started to express their concern that their foreign commander would not lead them to the promised land, but rather to death. Columbus had to impose his will on several occasions to prevent a mutiny on board. After all, the route that Columbus followed was based on his own intuition and the interpretation of scientific theories that had not been proved. On October 12, Columbus and his crew saw for the first time land in what would be known as the New World, and shortly after that they disembarked on the continent that was to change the destiny of Western civilization. It was a small island situated in the present-day Bahamas, and was named San Salvador. It was in this island where the first encounter in recorded history took place between the white man and the indigenous peoples of the American continent. From then on they were commonly known as Indians, precisely because Columbus insisted that he had reached the Indies. Columbus spent the first 3 months exploring the territories that he had discovered. One of the islands was named Hispaniola, where he built a fort called La Navidad, which constituted the first settlement of the Europeans in the New World. On March 15, 1493, Columbus made a triumphal entry into the port of Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain, and shortly afterward was received by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in Barcelona. He brought with him a few Indians, some parrots, and beads made out of gold to the court, with which he aimed to prove that the prospects for wealth creation in the lands he had reached were very considerable. After Columbus's return, the news of his discovery rapidly spread across Western Europe. Nevertheless, the lands that Columbus had explored were subject to great controversy. Several people among the royal entourage argued that the Genoese sailor did not deserve much credit for having simply discovered a few islands toward the west of the Canary Islands. Be that as it may, for Queen Isabella the evidence provided by Columbus was enough to convince her of the importance of this discovery and grant him the rewards he had demanded. His dreams of wealth and glory and founding a dynasty as a result of his discoveries were going to come true. On September 25, 1493, Christopher Columbus set out on the second journey to the New World, as the discovered lands were to be known. The admiral sailed south of his normal route, and this allowed him to discover the coast of present-day Venezuela and penetrate the delta of one of the great South American rivers, the Orinoco. Impressed by the immense landmass that seemed to have no end, on August 13 he wrote in his diary one of the most important sentences in the history of exploration: "I believe that this is a great continent that up to now has remained unknown." He continued thinking that the islands that he had discovered previously belonged to Asia, but, after sailing across the enormous coast of Venezuela, he reached the conclusion that he was before a new continent. Columbus was authorized by the Queen to make 2 more journeys to the New World. In the last one, in 1502, he explored the Isthmus of Central America, from where he reached the province of Veragua, among present-day Panama and Costa Rica, which were especially rich in gold deposits. His aim was to return to Spain with a great shipment of the precious metals, which would finally convince all his adversaries about the extraordinary prospects for wealth offered by the New World, but the tropical weather stood in the way. Storms prevented the members of this expedition from disembarking in such a promising land. A ship was lost and the fleet ended up shipwrecked in Jamaica. On top of this, Columbus had to repel an attack of indigenous peoples in this island and suppress a mutiny among his men. In spite of all adversity, Columbus managed to explore the Central American coast to the northern limit and prove that from present-day Honduras to Brazil, there was a great landmass. All this helped reaffirm his conclusion that he had discovered a new continent. Christopher Columbus died in 1506, shortly after returning to Spain from his last crossing to the New World. By the time of his death he was a wealthy man and had managed to establish his family among the Castilian aristocracy, but he left this world with the sad feeling of not having earned sufficient recognition for his geographic discoveries. Nevertheless, his place in history was to become increasingly more important as time passed. In the early 20th century, October 12, the date when Columbus arrived in America, was officially established as Spain's National Day. In this way, the Spaniards paid homage to the man who changed the country's fate and allowed it to transform itself into a global empire. Long before Spain, several countries in Latin America had been celebrating this date under the proud title of the Day of the Race. It was later to be celebrated under the less controversial and more friendly name of the Hispanidad, the Day of the Spanish-speaking people. Yet for many people in Latin America, the day of Columbus's arrival in America did not deserve to be commemorated. For this reason, in 2002, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela decided to rename this date as the Day of Indigenous Resistance, to honor the native people's resistance to European settlement that was to follow Columbus's arrival. On the other hand, in the United States, the Genoese Navigator is remembered every year on Columbus Day, which is celebrated with special enthusiasm by the Italian-American community, proud of the fact that a native from Genoa discovered America. A Latin American country received its name in his honor, Colombia. Nevertheless, for reasons that we shall see later, the continent was not named after the Genoese admiral but after a Florentine adventurer, much less talented as a sailor and discoverer, who arrived in the New World several years later, Omarigo Vespucci. Regardless of the recent attempts to vilify Columbus and make him primarily responsible for the decimation of the indigenous population, he must be seen as one of the most prominent figures of the Renaissance, whose vision contributed in a very While Spain started to enjoy the benefits of having discovered America, Portugal was not lagging behind. The King of Portugal was outraged by Pope Alexander VI's decision to grant Castile all sovereignty over the discovered lands in the New World, for he argued that his kingdom had led the era of discoveries. To put an end to the dispute between the two Iberian kingdoms, on June 7, 1494, the Treaty of Tortosillas was signed, which established a dividing line between the Azores and Hispaniola. All territories to the west of this imaginary line would be Spanish and those on the east belonged to Portugal. In this way, the world beyond the European continent became a duopoly blessed by the Pope. Apart from claiming a substantial part of the New World for Portugal, in 1498 a Portuguese subject managed to make a discovery that was almost as important as Columbus's, and it was to play a crucial role in the relationship between East and West, the route to India bordering Africa. On July 8, 1497, a sailor named Vasco de Gama set out on one of the most fascinating and significant voyages in history. De Gama had been born in 1460 in Sines, a city of great maritime tradition, and he inherited the project of sailing toward India from his father, a powerful man who had originally proposed it to King Manuel I. Vasco de Gama set out with a fleet of 4 ships. On November 7 he reached a place that he named as St. Helena Bay, on the coast of South Africa, after having reached a record of 96 days at sea without seeing land. In January 1499 he managed to sail across the dangerous Cape of Good Hope with better fortune than his predecessor Bartholomew Dias. From there his crew sailed in waters that were previously unknown to the Europeans. Present-day Natal was given this name by de Gama as he sailed past its coast on Christmas. On March 2 the fleet arrived in Mozambique, and he was surprised to discover that the inhabitants were of mixed race and spoke Arabic. A month later Vasco de Gama reached a town, Mombasa in present-day Kenya, where he was received with hostility by the inhabitants. For this reason he had to leave in a rush and sail up the coast until they reached Malindi on April 23, a peaceful town of white buildings. There, the so-called Raja who ruled over the territory welcomed them at the harbor, and Vasco de Gama responded to his hospitality, allowing him to inspect the Portuguese fleet. In Malindi they also discovered that there was an Indian who had converted to Christianity, an encouraging sign for propagating their faith as they were meant to do. From Malindi the Portuguese sailed toward the Arabian Sea, and after 3 weeks without seeing land, Vasco de Gama and his fleet became the first Europeans in recorded history to see the southwestern coast of the Indian subcontinent. On May 20, after a journey of 10 months and 2 weeks, Vasco de Gama fulfilled his aim and the ships dropped anchor at the city of Calicut. The Portuguese were given a warm welcome in the city that included a grand procession of upper-caste nairs, and de Gama was soon received by the sovereign, the Zamarin of Calicut. In the interview with the Zamarin, de Gama offered him several gifts on behalf of King Manuel, which included cloth, hats, barrels of oil, and a cask of honey. But the king of Calicut and his entourage were not impressed. Just as many other European travelers were to find out over the coming centuries in their first encounters with Asian civilizations, Western products were not highly valued. Instead, the Indian sovereign demanded the Portuguese to pay a customs duty in the universal currency, gold. De Gama was offended by this, and the relationship with their hosts was dramatically strained from then on. But in spite of the frustrating negotiations for initiating trade relations with Calicut, de Gama left India pretty satisfied for having discovered such a promising market. Very dangerous and unpleasant journey. But when he finally arrived, he not only gave the good news about a new route to India, but he brought a cargo that was worth several times the cost of the expedition. Consequently, he was rewarded in a similar way to Columbus, including the title of Admiral of the Indian Seas. Vasco de Gama's achievement contributed to a large extent to transform Portugal into an imperial nation, well aware of its power in the world. From then on, King Manuel made himself known by the grand title of King of Portugal and the Algarves, Lord of Guinea, and of the conquest, navigation, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. Having discovered a new sea route to the east, the next step was to establish the first settlements in these remote lands. On March 9, 1500, the Portuguese monarch sent a new fleet of 13 ships to India, captained by Pedro Álvares Cabral, who traveled not as an explorer but as a conqueror. He was accompanied by Bartholomew Dias, who was going to be in charge of founding a commercial settlement of Sofala, in what became present-day Mozambique. This expedition marked the history of European expansion for very different reasons to what they expected. Cabral decided to sail toward the southwest. Maritime currents and a great tempest diverted him to the point of casually reaching an unknown area in the coast of the American continent on April 22, 1500. Cabral named this territory as Vera Cruz. The Portuguese were well received by the indigenous people who inhabited the region, and they helped them explore the area, but they did not find anything particularly valuable. Discouraged by such modest results, the Portuguese fleet resumed the journey to India, and Cabral did not attribute any importance to the discovery for which he was going to make history. He simply sent a ship to Lisbon notifying them of the existence of Vera Cruz. In 1501, the King of Portugal commissioned a Florentine navigator and merchant named Omarigo Vespucci with the mission of sailing across the coasts of the lands discovered by Cabral. Vespucci had emigrated to Seville in 1492, one of the most advanced cities in those days, and it was there that he was offered the great opportunity of his life, to travel to the New World. A man of great ambition, his ultimate aim was to succeed where Columbus had failed, finding a western route toward India. In 1499 he set out to the New World in a ship captained by the Spanish conquistador Alonso de Ojeda. In this journey they reached the coast of present-day Venezuela's Maracaibo, where they discovered that the indigenous people lived in huts that had been built on the water. This reminded Vespucci of Venice, and led Ojeda to call this land Little Venice, or Venezuela. Having consolidated a solid reputation as a navigator under the orders of the Castilian sovereign, Vespucci was recruited by Portugal for the most important mission of his career. Between 1501 and 1502 he sailed across the coast of present-day Brazil up to Rio de la Plata, an area of Spanish influence. The Florentine wrote that nothing of value was found except an infinity of tainted trees. Nevertheless, on returning to Lisbon he wrote a letter to the Medici family, for whom he had worked at an earlier stage of his career, commenting that in his view the lands traversed in the expedition were a new continent. Vespucci's comment in a private letter was to have deep consequences in the history of the New World. For this letter reached the hands of Martin Waldseemüller, a Swiss cartographer who published a new edition of Ptolemy's cosmography in 1507, with a world map that included the most recent discoveries. The Swiss decided that the lands of the New World should be known as America in honor of the person who had reached the conclusion that a new continent had been discovered. With this he did not wish to tarnish the reputation of Columbus, whom he considered the discoverer of new lands in Asia, but not of a continent, like Vespucci. Nevertheless, some years later, when it became evident that the discoveries of Columbus and Vespucci were part of the same continent, Waldseemüller tried to correct his error. In a map published in 1513, he attempted to rename the New World as the Unknown Land. But it was too late. The name America had spread across both sides of the Atlantic, and even though both the Spaniards and the Portuguese continued talking about the New World, or the Indies, the name with which the recently discovered continent was going to be known both in the West and in the rest of the world was America. In this way Vespucci achieved universal fame not for his merits as explorer but thanks to the power of publicity. What was going to make the eastern coast of the New World attractive for European trade was Brazil wood, a tree that grew plentifully in that area and from which present-day Brazil got its name. In 1503 6 ships set sail from Lisbon under the command of Goncalo Coelho, one of which was captained by Omarigo Vespucci, and the two returned with great shiploads of the beautiful hard red timber that was going to be increasingly demanded in the old continent. Brazil wood was not monopolized by Portugal despite the fact that it grew in a territory that was under its sovereignty. While the first Portuguese ships arrived in America, a French mariner known as Palmer de Gonaville arrived on the coast of Brazil by accident, just as it had happened to Cabral, and he took a shipload of the coveted trees to France. The success with which Gonaville introduced Brazil wood to his country encouraged many European merchants to send expeditions to this region, especially from the ports of Honfleur and Dieppe, to the point that Brazil started to be known as Equatorial France. With this incursion in Brazilian territory, the French had timidly begun their overseas expansion. Despite the increasing demand for Brazil wood, Portugal paid little attention to the American possessions, considering them much less important than the Asian or African ones. But the growing presence of French ships on Brazilian coasts convinced the King of Portugal that in order to keep them under his sovereignty their colonization would have to be promoted. In 1526 a squadron of 6 warships was sent from Lisbon to America, and as it approached the coasts of Brazil it sank 3 French ships. 5 years later, another armada of 5 ships was sent under Martim Afonso de Sousa, who founded at Pernambuco one of the first European settlements. In this way, the official history of Portugal's largest and most cherished colony was to begin, Brazil. After initiating the settlement in the islands of the Caribbean as a result of Columbus's discoveries, the Spanish crown was to expand its possessions in the mainland, where the most famous adventures of the Spanish conquistadors were going to take place. A small group of men not only managed to conquer vast territories for their crown, but even continued making extraordinary discoveries. Such was the case of Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Vasco Núñez de Balboa emigrated to Hispaniola in 1501, the first major Spanish settlement in America. In 1509 he decided to join an expedition to the province of New Andalusia, in present-day Colombia. His great charisma soon led him to become one of the leaders of the expedition. After arriving on the mainland, Balboa led his men to victory in several battles against the indigenous people, and he founded the first permanent settlement in American continental lands, Santa Maria. He was appointed mayor and governor of Veragua, but Núñez de Balboa was more of a conqueror than a governor, and in 1513 he led an expedition to the Isthmus of Panama in search of gold and a place for a new settlement. Balboa reached a region where he was told about the existence of another sea toward the south, which theoretically had gold in abundance. After this revelation on September 1, 1513, he set out with 190 Spaniards and several indigenous people who knew the territory. On September 25 he climbed up a mountain that would give him a better perspective of the area. On reaching the summit he saw for the first time the waters of a sea that was unknown until then by Europeans. 3 days after that, he reached the beach with the rest of the members of the expedition, and he took possession of this unknown sea on behalf of the sovereigns of Castile, naming it the Southern Sea. This event marked the beginning of the European exploration and discovery of the Pacific Ocean. In this expedition, the conqueror also discovered lands that were especially rich in gold, which he named as Pearl Archipelago, for obvious reasons. In January 1514, Núñez de Balboa returned to Santa Maria with a great booty. He sent an emissary to Spain so that he would hand in a part of the accumulated wealth and notify the court about the new sea that from then on would be under Spanish sovereignty. The news of the discovery of the Southern Sea led Emperor Charles V to send an expedition of 1,500 men and 17 ships, the most numerous and best equipped that had so far been sent to America. But it was sent under the command of Pedro Arias de Vila, better known as Pedrarias, whom he had named as governor of the province of Golden Castile. Balboa received with great disappointment the news that he would have to submit to the command of a new governor. Nevertheless, the crown decided to reward him for his extraordinary services with the appointment of the honorary title of Adelantado, or Commander of the Southern Sea and Governor of Panama and Coibu. As it usually happened with the relationships between the Spanish conquerors, it was only possible to consolidate power by means of eliminating others. Pedrarias distrusted Balboa from the outset, and sent a group of men led by a soldier named Francisco Pizarro, who was later to make history with the conquest of the Inca Empire, as we shall see, with the aim of arresting him under the charges of treason and attempting to create a separate government in the Southern Sea. After being captured, Balboa was sentenced to death. "I have served the king with loyalty, thinking only of increasing his dominions," he shouted from the executioner's platform shortly before being beheaded. This was the ignominious end of the European who discovered the Pacific. After getting rid of his great rival, Pedrarias founded Panama on August 15, 1519. Despite the spitefulness with which he had put an end to Balboa's life, Pedrarias managed to be confirmed as governor. Nevertheless, history gave Vasco Núñez de Balboa his due, for he was going to be remembered as one of the great discoverers, especially in Panama, where avenues, monuments, and even the official currency bear his name. Meanwhile, the western route toward Asia continued to be the great aim in the era of discovery. It was finally achieved, curiously, as a result of a joint Spanish-Portuguese endeavor. In 1518, a Portuguese captain, Ferdinand Magellan, proposed a voyage with the aim of finding the strait that would lead to the Southern Sea, and from there to the Moluccas, the archipelago in Indonesia that was particularly rich in spices. Magellan had a bad relationship with the Portuguese king because of a personal dispute, and for this reason he offered his project to the Spanish sovereign, who enthusiastically supported it. He set out on September 20th, 1519, with 5 ships and around 250 men. His warrant officer was a Basque sailor known as Juan Sebastián Elcano. A third of the members of the crew were not Spanish, and 15 were Portuguese. Over 80% of the expedition's cost was paid by the king, for which it could be considered a royal venture. A substantial part of the royal contribution came from the gold imported from the Indies. In the long journey to the southern Atlantic, Magellan had to face a mutiny that he managed to suppress with great difficulty. Finally, after sailing across the southern coast of the American continent, he went into a strait that was later going to bear his name. After crossing it with strong winds and a very rough sea, on September 28 he was thrilled to sail into the sea which he named the Pacific, due to the remarkable tranquility of its waters. After traversing the coast of present-day Chile, Magellan and his crew sailed toward the northeast with the aim of exploring the unknown Pacific Ocean. It proved to be an infernal trip because they ran out of water and also experienced a food shortage, but finally they reached the Mariana Islands, south of Japan, in March 1521, and in this way Columbus's old ambition was finally achieved 3 decades later. After recovering in Asian lands, the crew sailed to the archipelago that was later to be known as the Philippines. In one of the islands, Magellan established a good relationship with the king of Zubu and managed to convert him to Christianity. In order to please him, he acceded to help him in his struggle against a neighboring tribe, a tragic mistake, for he paid for his generosity with his life when he was killed by the enemy tribes in combat. In this way, the arrival of Europeans not always brought misfortune to the natives, nor is it true that the Europeans only thought of their own benefit. Juan Sebastián Elcano substituted for Magellan and completed the journey with success, although paying a very high price for it. Only 1 ship out of a total of 5 that initiated the voyage managed to reach Cádiz in southern Spain. It was on September 6, 1520, and only 18 men were on board. The king conceded the Basque sailor a coat of arms with a globe under which the motto Primus Circumdidiste me could be read. With this great feat, the theory that the earth was round was proved beyond any doubt, and finally, the route toward the Far East through the Pacific was open. Spain and Portugal took the lead in the era of discoveries and even managed to obtain the papal blessing to divide the New World exclusively between themselves. What was the reaction of the rival powers in Europe? The news spread rapidly of Columbus's voyages and other great discoveries made by the kingdoms of Castile and Portugal through most of Europe, in spite of the era's poor communications. Sailors rapidly spread the news of the Iberian major discoveries through the ports of Western Europe, while ambassadors, special envoys, and spies duly reported to their courts on the Castilian and Portuguese expansion plans that could threaten their interests. The news about the existence of a new world to the west rapidly stimulated the imagination of navigators, fortune-seekers, sovereigns, and statesmen in all major European states, and consequently the Iberian kingdoms were soon to find rivals in its exploration and settlement. Just as those of the Spanish Empire, the origins of the British and French empires are also linked to the voyages of Italian navigators. It is not surprising that some of most important contributions to the discovery of the New World came from the Italian peninsula. Citizens of city-states like Genoa or Venice enjoyed the benefits of a great maritime tradition and a formidable entrepreneurial spirit after centuries of wealth creation from trade in the Mediterranean. But from the late 15th century, the opportunities for developing new markets were no longer in the Mediterranean Sea but in the Atlantic Ocean. The most innovative projects to discover new trading routes beyond the confines of the Western world required the backing of the major Atlantic powers. And this is why, together with Christopher Columbus or Omarigo Vespucci, several Italian navigators were eager to approach the courts of Western Europe that had the capacity to expand through the Atlantic. The life of Giovanni Caboto, or John Cabot, as he was going to be known in English, bears similarities to Columbus. He was born around 1450, it is not clear whether it was in Genoa or Gaeta. He relocated to Venice when he was very young in order to start earning a living as a merchant, and in the 1490s he emigrated to Valencia. It was there that Cabot found out about the great feat of his countryman Columbus. As a result of it, he decided to devote his career to find a shorter route to Asia than Neither the Castilian nor the Portuguese courts were interested in Cabot's offer, and for this reason he moved his permanent residence to England in 1495. A very wise decision, for King Henry VII, who had been eagerly promoting trade links with several Italian cities, was well informed about the extraordinary contributions made by Italian navigators to the Iberian kingdoms. For this reason, when the King of England heard of Cabot's proposal, he duly commissioned the project, granting him 5 ships that would sail under the English flag with as many sailors as he could recruit. Cabot failed in his first